New York City pulsed beneath the floor-to-ceiling windows like a living circuit board, a glittering sprawl of ambition, power, and relentless movement. From the corner of his penthouse suite at the Ritz-Carlton in Midtown Manhattan, Graham Sinclair stood unmoving, staring into the distant darkness. The glass of Dalmore whiskey in his hand remained untouched, his grip firm, knuckles pale. The celebration downstairs, meant to mark his company's billion-dollar acquisition, had ended hours ago, but he hadn't gone. He never did. The parties were for shareholders and vultures, not for him. Graham didn't celebrate victories. He expected them. The room behind him glowed softly with golden light, casting sharp angles on his profile. Tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably tailored, he looked every inch the man the world feared. Sinclair, the self-made tech mogul who disrupted markets, toppled giants, and built an empire with nothing but instinct and steel. His face, all carved jaw and unreadable eyes, was a study in restraint. That restraint, however, had worn thin tonight. He should have felt satisfied. Months of cutthroat negotiation had culminated in a final signature this morning. His competitors silenced, his critics outplayed. It was a flawless win, so why did the silence around him feel louder than ever? The clink of ice shifting in his glass brought no comfort. The darkness inside him had grown too familiar to be calmed by alcohol. He turned toward the bar, ready to pour another drink he didn't need, when he heard the soft click of the suite's front door. He froze. No one should be entering. His security detail was obsessive, his privacy ironclad. And yet, there it was again, the sound of heels hesitating on marble. A breath caught mid-thought. He turned sharply, and there she stood. The woman in the doorway was not dressed to seduce. She wasn't painted in the thick gloss of evening wear, nor armed with the knowing smile of someone with an agenda. She looked confused, out of place, as if she had walked through a portal and ended up somewhere she didn't belong. Her hair was golden and loose, cascading in soft waves over her shoulders. Her features were delicate, her makeup minimal, her body clothed in a simple navy dress that seemed chosen for modesty, not allure. But her eyes, startled and luminous beneath long lashes, met his with a kind of vulnerable clarity he hadn't seen in years, if ever. "Hi," she said cautiously, her voice soft. "I think I'm in the wrong room." Her words were harmless, but they crashed against something deep and cynical in Graham's gut. This wasn't the first time a woman had accidentally stumbled into his space, and they were never wrong. They were sent, bought, planned. Whether by the press, by rivals, or by their own ambition, the outcome was always the same, a scandal waiting to happen. He hardened instantly. "You're not late," he said coldly, stepping closer. "But your handlers forgot to brief you better. You were supposed to play the part." Clara Monroe blinked. She took a small step back, her confusion deepening. "I don't understand. Someone asked me to come up. A concierge. They said it was urgent, something left behind by a friend." Graham's jaw tightened. It sounded plausible, too plausible, but he had been burned before. The kindness in her eyes did nothing to temper the wall rising within him. It wasn't personal. It was self-preservation. "You don't have to explain," he said, voice dipped in disdain. "Just do what you were paid to do and leave before this becomes a problem." Her mouth parted in shock. "Paid to what? No, I think there's been a mistake." He cut her off with a look that made most men flinch. "Right. You're not that kind of girl. Of course not. You just happen to appear alone, uninvited, in a billionaire suite wearing silk and perfume." "I'm not wearing perfume," she said almost defensively, and then flushed, as if realizing how absurd her voice sounded against the weight of the moment. He stepped closer, her shoulders pressed into the doorframe behind her. He didn't touch her, but the threat hung in the air, not of violence but of judgment, of assumptions that couldn't be unmade. "Look," she whispered, her eyes wide now, shimmering with fear. "I don't know who you are, or what you think I'm doing here, but I didn't sign up for this." "You signed up for whatever game they're playing," he said. "You're just the latest piece on a board I've seen 1,000 times. I've dealt with your type before." Her breath stilled, then slowly she reached into her purse and held up her phone, hands trembling. "This is my friend Ava. She told me to come to the lobby to pick up her laptop. That's it. She asked me as a favor because she was running late for a benefit dinner." Graham didn't look at the screen, didn't want to. Because if he did, and it turned out she was telling the truth, he'd have to confront something far, More difficult than a trap. He'd have to confront his own cruelty. Still, something about her voice, its fragility, its effort to stay steady, slipped under his skin. "Who sent you to this floor?" he asked. "I don't know their names. 2 men in suits. They said they were hotel staff and that I needed to deliver it to a VIP. I told them it didn't make sense, but they insisted. Then they pressed the button and stepped away." His silence stretched. She wasn't lying. He didn't know how he knew, but he did, and that terrified him, because it meant everything that had come before. The accusation, the ice in his voice, the way he had looked at her like she was disposable, wasn't just wrong, it was brutal. Her breathing grew shallow. She was trembling now visibly, and still she stood there, small yet unbroken, like a candle refusing to go out. "I'm going to leave now," she whispered. "Please don't follow me." She turned, reaching for the handle with a shaking hand. But before she could open the door, he spoke, his voice hoarse, a different man suddenly inhabiting his body. "Wait." She paused. He hated how hard it was to say the next words. "I was wrong." Clara didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge him, but she froze. And in that stillness, something fragile passed between them. "I've made mistakes," he said. Still no reply. But this time when she left, quietly, firmly, he didn't stop her. He didn't touch her. He simply watched her disappear into the hallway, the echo of her presence lingering like a guilt he couldn't drink away. Alone again, Graham stood in the same room with the same city glittering beneath him. Only now it looked different. Colder, sharper, and infinitely lonelier. He didn't know her name, didn't know where she was going. But somehow he knew this wasn't the last time their paths would cross, because that night in a room built on power and silence, a stranger had walked in and dismantled something inside him he hadn't even realized was broken. She had looked at him not with desire or calculation, but with fear, and for the first time in years, Graham Sinclair hated the man she saw. The days that followed were a blur. Clara Monroe couldn't fully remember, and Graham Sinclair couldn't forget. She'd left the suite that night without looking back, holding herself together just long enough to step into the elevator. The moment the doors closed, the tears came. Not loud, not violent, just silent, steady drops that fell like something sacred had been cracked open and spilled onto the polished marble floors of that glittering cage. By the time she reached the sidewalk, her legs felt like they barely belonged to her. The street hummed with life. Traffic, laughter, the buzz of an uncaring city. No one noticed her. Not the doorman, not the cab driver. And maybe that was the worst part. That something inside her had just been bruised in a way she couldn't name. And the world simply moved on. She didn't tell Ava. Couldn't. How could she explain something that hadn't happened but had still changed her? How could she describe the way a man's words, his assumptions, his disgust had made her feel smaller than she'd ever felt in her life? At home, she sat on the edge of her bed, wrapped in a blanket, staring at her reflection in the window. And for a long time, she wondered if she should have screamed, should have hit him, should have fought back harder, but it hadn't been physical. That was the trick of it. It had been something colder, sharper, more calculated, and far harder to erase. Across the city, Graham hadn't moved from the suite for hours after she left. The bottle of whiskey sat untouched on the bar. He stood by the window, watching the city as though he could find her face in the crowd below. He didn't know her name. Hadn't asked. That detail gnawed at him more than it should have. More than anything had in years. He'd built his empire on the assumption that people had motives. That kindness was a disguise. That women, especially beautiful ones, were playing a game. He hadn't always been like that. But life had taught him enough lessons to harden every soft place he'd once carried. He hadn't seen innocence in so long, he'd forgotten what it looked like. But now it haunted him. Her voice, the way it broke when she said, "I didn't sign up for this." The panic in her eyes when he stepped closer. That wasn't performance, that was real, and he had thrown it back at her like it was worthless. It would have been easier if she'd screamed, or slapped him, or even cried. But she hadn't. She'd simply walked away with her dignity barely intact and left him standing there with the weight of his own monstrosity pressing down on his chest. Later that night, unable to stand the stillness, Graham reviewed the suite's security footage. He watched as she entered the building. Alone. Hesitant. He watched her look around the lobby, checking her phone, scanning the crowd like someone waiting for a friend, not a job. He watched as two men in suits approached her, said something, too low for the audio to catch, and pointed her toward the elevator. He watched as she obeyed, and when she entered his floor, when the suite door opened and she stepped inside with confusion painting her every move, he felt something cold crawl through his veins. She hadn't been acting. She hadn't been sent. She had been used, not by him, but by someone else. Someone who knew Graham's paranoia. Someone who'd counted on him to react exactly as he had, and he had, perfectly cruelly. He ran a hand over his face and exhaled. For the first time in his adult life, he felt unsure of what to do. He couldn't call her. He didn't even know her name. He could have asked security, pulled strings. But that felt wrong, predatory. So he waited. He told himself it was because he didn't want to make things worse. But deep down it was because he didn't know how to face what he'd done. And then a week later, fate intervened. He saw her again. She was walking out of a bookstore in Soho, her arms full of paperbacks, her face turned up toward the weak spring sun. There was a smile on her lips, small, private, like she'd just remembered something beautiful. And for a moment, Graham forgot how to breathe. He stayed across the street, didn't speak, didn't approach, just watched her. But that image, that sliver of peace on her face, branded itself into him. He needed to know more. By the next day, he knew her name. Clara Monroe, 24, graduate of Vermont University, English major, moved to New York 8 months ago. Worked part-time at an independent library in Brooklyn, lived in a modest one-bedroom walk-up with a view of nothing but brick. She was exactly who she appeared to be. No secrets, no scandals, no lies, just Clara. The realization gutted him. She hadn't tricked him, hadn't manipulated anything. She had simply walked into his world and collided with the worst version of himself, and he had nearly destroyed something he didn't even understand. A few days later, he saw her again, at a corner cafe. This time, he sat at a distance, watching her stir honey into a tea, watching the way she flipped through a worn journal with a pen tucked behind her ear. She smiled at something on the page. Graham didn't smile. He ached because the truth had finally crystallized. She was a virgin, and somehow that fact, so personal, so private, held more power than he knew how to process. It wasn't about virtue. It wasn't even about sex. It was about how utterly, catastrophically wrong he had been. About her. About everything. He thought he had trained himself to see through illusions. But Clara wasn't an illusion. She was the exception to every rule. He had built his life around, and he had failed her. He remembered her voice pleading, "I don't belong here. I'm not who you think I am." He had ignored it, remembered the way her hands trembled, the way she shrank from him like prey in the presence of a predator. He had seen the fear, and he had believed it was a performance. Now, it replayed in his head like a punishment that wouldn't end. That night, Graham sat in the darkness of his penthouse, the city pulsing outside his windows, and admitted something he never thought he would. He was ashamed, not because of scandal, not because someone had outmaneuvered him, but because for the first time he had hurt someone innocent. And the worst part, he couldn't undo it. The next morning he sent flowers to the library where she worked. No card, no name, just lilies and wildflowers in a ceramic vase. She sent them back. He sent a book the following day, her favorite author, first edition. It was returned without comment. He didn't blame her. He just didn't know how to stop trying. Because something had shifted in him the moment she left his suite. And now every breath felt heavier without her. It wasn't about fixing his image or easing his conscience. It was about her, Clara Monroe, the woman who had shown him what he was, and the woman who, without even meaning to, had made him want to be something more. He knew he couldn't force her to forgive him, but maybe if he moved slowly enough, if he stayed in the shadows and let her come to her own conclusions, there might still be time. Time to change. Time to prove he wasn't the man who had once looked her in the eyes and saw nothing but a lie. He had been wrong, and the truth had shattered him. But maybe, just maybe, that same truth could rebuild something new, something real. And for the first time in years, Graham Sinclair hoped, not for another victory, not for power, but for a second chance. With her. The rhythm of the city moved on, unconcerned. with the quiet war unfolding between a man who'd forgotten how to feel and a woman trying to forget him. Clara Monroe didn't tell anyone what had happened that night at the Ritz-Carlton. Not Ava. Not her colleagues at the library. Not even the therapist she'd seen once during college when grief had left her raw. There was a certain pain that couldn't be shared, not because it was unspeakable, but because saying it aloud would make it too real. And she couldn't afford for it to be real, so she folded the memory and buried it deep like a page she refused to turn back to. She worked her shifts. She took walks. She stopped writing in her journal. The words once so easy no longer came. Her thoughts had become shadows she couldn't chase down, always there, just beyond the reach of clarity. But she was surviving. And sometimes that had to be enough. She never noticed the car parked across the street from her apartment. Never noticed how the same man appeared at the coffee shop 2 blocks away, always pretending to read the Times, never once turning the page. She didn't know she was being followed. Graham Sinclair knew everything about Clara Monroe now. Her routines. Her favorite bakery in the East Village. The way she paused at the same stall in the Union Square Farmers Market to smell the lavender she never bought. She liked quiet places, bookstores and gardens. She never stayed out late. She didn't answer numbers she didn't recognize. She had, as far as he could tell, no romantic entanglements, no major social life, and no family in the city. Her world was small, self-contained, like she'd built it that way on purpose. And he stayed outside it, at first, but watching her became a ritual. Not because he meant to, not because he thought it was right, but because he didn't know how else to exist with the guilt. If he couldn't undo the past, maybe he could protect her future. He told himself he was only keeping her safe. After all, someone had used her to get to him. Someone had known precisely what buttons to push, and they had pushed them flawlessly. What if they tried again? What if she became a pawn in a bigger, darker game? But deep down, Graham knew he wasn't just guarding her. He was tethering himself to her presence. He told his head of security that she was to be observed discreetly. No contact, no interference, just proximity. Invisible walls of surveillance installed without her knowledge. She never needed to know. He'd make sure no one came near her again. Not to hurt her, not to use her. He had failed her once. He wouldn't do it again. And still, despite every rational justification, the truth rotted at the edges of his conscience. He wasn't just watching her, he was obsessed. It wasn't lust. That would have been simple, containable. This was need, and need, Graham had learned, was dangerous. It began subtly. The first time was when she was running late for work and missed the train, and he sent a town car 2 blocks ahead to wait in case she needed it. She never saw it, never knew. But he exhaled only when she stepped onto the next train. Then came the storm, a sharp April downpour that caught her without an umbrella. By the time she reached the library, her hair was soaked, her clothes clinging to her frame. He'd watched from across the street, fingers twitching against the urge to run to her, to shield her, to offer warmth. But she didn't break. She laughed, to herself. A quiet, unexpected sound that twisted something in his chest. She shook the water from her sleeves and walked inside like she hadn't just been drenched by the universe. That night he dreamed of her smile. The next day he sent a package to the library, a cashmere scarf in a muted color he'd seen her wear before. No note, no brand tag. Just the softness of an apology he couldn't say aloud. She returned it. Again. The next morning, a letter arrived at her apartment. A simple envelope with no return address. Inside, just a single sheet of heavyweight paper. Typed, anonymous. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Clara read it twice, then set it on fire over her kitchen sink. But she didn't throw it away immediately. She stared at the curling edges, at the way the flame ate the apology letter by letter. And for the first time in days, she felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not fear, just sadness. Because she knew, without knowing how, that the man who had written those words had meant them. But it wasn't enough. Not after the way he'd looked at her. Like she was for sale. Like she was nothing. Even now she could feel the weight of that moment pressing against her ribs. She should have told someone. Should have filed a complaint. Should have reported the men who had cornered her in the lobby. But nothing had happened. Not technically. There was no mark, no threat, just implication. And implication was slippery. No one would believe her. Not against a man like Graham Sinclair. So she stayed quiet. And Graham, he began to unravel. He was still Graham on the surface, Still sharp, still merciless in boardrooms, still the man with more money than morality. But his routines faltered. His meetings grew shorter. His temper shorter still. He caught himself staring at blank screens, the memory of Clara's eyes replacing the data he was meant to process. He walked past mirrors and didn't recognize the man glaring back. He saw her everywhere. Not literally, but in fragments. A girl on the subway reading a dog-eared novel. A scent in a flower shop. A pair of rain boots by a stranger's door. It didn't matter how fast he moved or how much he distracted himself. She was there. Inescapable. One night, 2 weeks after their last contact, he broke his own rule. He went to her. Not directly. Not as Graham Sinclair. He dressed down. Jeans, a hoodie, a baseball cap pulled low. He stood outside the building where she lived and waited. Not to confront her, not to force an apology. Just to see her. But when she finally emerged, she wasn't. Alone. A man was walking beside her, tall, well-dressed, laughing easily. She laughed too. Not quite fully. Not like the smile he'd seen in the rain. But enough to send a spike of something jagged through Graham's chest. He didn't move. Didn't follow. He turned and walked away. That night he drank more than he should. He sat on his balcony in the dark, the city roaring around him, and whispered her name into the wind like a prayer he knew wouldn't be answered. Clara. She haunted him, not like a ghost but like a mirror. She made him see everything he had become, and everything he might have been if he hadn't stopped believing people were good. And now, it was too late. The next morning, his security team informed him that Clara had been approached online by a fake recruiter from a rival firm. The messages were subtle but intentional, the implication clear. Someone was still trying to use her. Graham didn't hesitate. He doubled the surveillance. But more than that, he made a decision. He would bring her somewhere safe. Somewhere no one could reach her. Not because he owned her. Not because she was his to protect. But because he couldn't bear the thought of someone else hurting her the way he almost had. That evening, Clara came home to find a woman in a navy suit standing outside her door. "Ms. Monroe," she said, professional but calm. "There's been a threat made against your safety. We've been assigned to escort you to a secure location." Clara froze. "Assigned by who?" The woman didn't answer. Only handed her a letter signed in pen. "Please. Let me keep you safe this time." It was his handwriting. She should have slammed the door, should have screamed, should have run. But something inside her, some small exhausted part, was too afraid not to listen. Too tired of pretending she wasn't scared. She let them lead her. Away. And when she arrived at the estate in Martha's Vineyard, when she saw the ocean through the glass walls and the unfamiliar softness of a place designed for solitude, she realized she wasn't being imprisoned. She was being hidden. Not from him, from everyone else. The irony wasn't lost on her. The man who had once made her feel powerless was now the only one with enough power to protect her. But it didn't make her feel safer. It made her feel like she was standing in a different kind of trap. Only this time it was carved from guilt and obsession and something she couldn't name yet. Something terrifyingly close to love. The air in Martha's Vineyard was scented with salt and silence. Clara Monroe stood at the edge of the estate's cliffside garden, arms crossed tightly against her chest, not because she was cold, but because the stillness wrapped too tightly around her. The ocean below raged against the rocks with a voice, louder than anything she had heard in days. There were no locks on the doors here, no guards in visible uniforms. But it was a prison nonetheless. A beautiful, manicured, sprawling prison with linen sheets and curated meals, designed perhaps not to confine her body, but to contain her mind. Graham hadn't shown his face in 3 days. She didn't know whether to be relieved or insulted. They had brought her here under the premise of protection, and in fairness, the threat he had warned her about wasn't a lie. Clara had seen the messages herself, cryptic outreach from someone pretending to offer her a publishing internship. But the timing, the questions, the unnatural interest, it reeked of something deeper. Still, being watched by strangers was one thing. Being saved by the man who had once treated her like property was another. She had wandered the estate's grounds twice a day since arriving, finding corners of peace only to be reminded by the silence that she was still under someone else's control. No matter how softly the staff spoke or how luxurious the surroundings, she knew what this was. A gilded cage with his fingerprints on every surface. And yet she stayed. Not because she trusted him, but because she didn't trust the world outside. More. Her eyes lifted toward the horizon where sky met water, and she closed them briefly, breathing in the scent of salt and pine. She didn't hear the soft scuff of shoes on stone until someone spoke behind her. "You look like a prisoner, waiting for a jailbreak." Clara turned sharply. The voice wasn't Graham's. It didn't even sound like anyone on his staff. The man was standing just a few feet away, one hand tucked into the pocket of a tailored overcoat, the other holding a small paper cup of espresso. He looked like he had walked out of a European magazine ad, handsome, clean-shaven, with eyes too knowing for a stranger. He smiled, not charming but curious, his head tilted slightly as if sizing her up like a puzzle he wanted to solve. "Who are you?" she asked, instinctively taking a step back. "Julian Cross," he replied smoothly. "An old friend of the man who owns this prison, or rival depending on how generous you're feeling." She blinked. "You know Graham?" "Too well." He took a sip of his coffee. "Let's just say we have different philosophies about people and power." Clara studied him, unsure whether to be afraid. "What are you doing here?" "I have a home nearby. I take walks when I get bored. And sometimes when the wind is right, I hear whispers from this cliff." He looked at her meaningfully. "Today, they sounded a lot like you." Clara didn't answer. Julian's tone shifted. "I know what happened, Clara. Or at least I know enough. The suite, the trap. I know what he did." Something twisted inside her. "You don't know anything. I know he made a mistake, a terrible one. I know he brought you here not to apologize, but to contain his regret. And I know most of all that he'll never let you go." Clara's throat tightened. "So what, you came here to offer me an escape?" He smiled again, more gently this time. "I came to offer you a choice, something no one else seems willing to give you." "Why?" "Because Graham Sinclair only knows how to possess. He doesn't know how to deserve. And you?" Julian's gaze softened. "You deserve better than to be a chapter in someone else's redemption arc." Her heart fluttered. Rage, confusion, hope, fear, all tangled into one. She had been waiting for someone to say those words. Someone who didn't look at her like a broken thing or a mistake to be atoned for. Julian spoke with the calm confidence of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. And maybe that's why it scared her more than anything Graham had ever done. "What do you want in return?" she asked, her voice low. He didn't flinch. "Nothing." She stared at him. He sighed. "Fine. That's not entirely true. I want to take something from Graham. Something he doesn't know how to hold gently. Something he never deserved to have in the first place." Clara's breath hitched. "So this isn't about me. It's about revenge." Julian stepped closer. "This is about you having the power to decide. Isn't that what you've wanted all along?" She didn't answer. "Come with me," he said. "Right now. I'll have a car here in 10 minutes. No threats, no pressure. Just the door you've been waiting to see opened." And for a moment, just one suspended heartbeat, Clara wanted to believe him. She imagined slipping away from this place, leaving Graham behind without a word. No more watching the horizon. No more wondering if she was healing or just adapting to captivity. No more unanswered questions and silent guilt. Just freedom. But something stopped her, and she didn't understand it until she turned around and saw him. Graham was standing at the edge of the stone path, breathless as if he had run here. His jaw was tight, his eyes shadowed beneath the weight of too many sleepless nights, and for once there was no anger in his face. Only fear, not fear of Julian, fear of losing her. "Step away from her," he said, voice low but steady. Julian didn't move. "You're late." Graham ignored him, his eyes locked on Clara. "Are you all right?" Clara nodded once but didn't speak. "Interesting," Julian mused. "You ask if she's all right, but you never ask what she wants. Isn't that your whole problem, Graham? You never learn to ask." Graham stepped forward. "She doesn't want you. You don't know what she wants." Julian turned to her. "Do you?" She stood frozen between them. One man offering escape. One man offering what? Remorse? Redemption? Something that looked a little too much like love? Julian offered his hand. Graham offered nothing. Only his presence. Only his history with her, broken and bloodied as it was. "Go with him," Graham said quietly, shocking even himself. If that's what you need. If you want freedom from me, you can have it. Clara's breath caught. Her eyes met his, searching for the man who had once made her feel so small, and finding instead a man who had finally made himself smaller for her. Not by force, but by choice. She turned to Julian. I appreciate the offer, she said, voice steady but distant. But I'm not a token to trade between men. Julian's expression faltered. I'll find my own way out, she added. On my own terms. And just like that, she walked away from both of them. Back toward the estate. Back toward the place she still wasn't sure she belonged. Graham watched her go, breath stuck in his lungs. Julian shook his head. You may have kept her this time, but it won't last. You're not built for love, Graham. You're built for war. Don't confuse the two. And with that he left. Graham didn't chase him, didn't speak. He stood in the wind for a long time, feeling the weight of what almost slipped through his fingers again. And then he turned and followed the path she had walked, not to lead, not to chase, but to walk beside her, if she would let him, if she ever could. Clara didn't stop walking until she reached the edge of the orchard just beyond the villa. The sun had started to dip low in the sky, throwing long shadows over the grass. Wind tangled in her hair, and for a moment she wished it would carry her far away. Beyond this life she didn't choose, beyond these men who thought they understood her. She sat on a stone bench under a canopy of olive trees and let the silence press in. For all the things Julian had said, for all the ways he had carefully crafted his offer of escape to appeal to her loneliness, something about it had felt too convenient, too polished. He had seen her as a symbol, freedom weaponized, a piece on a chessboard to move against Graham. But Graham, what had he seen? A mistake? A savior? A mirror? The worst part wasn't that she didn't know. The worst part was that she didn't know what she wanted him to see. Footsteps approached. Quiet ones. Slower now. Less sure. She didn't have to turn to know it was him. I didn't know he would find you, Graham said quietly, standing a few feet away. Clara didn't answer. I've made enemies in ways I used to call strategy. Julian was one of them. I underestimated how deeply he wanted to hurt me. By using me, she asked, her voice calm but flat. He hesitated. Yes, but not in the same way I did. He doesn't see you, Clara. Not really. He just sees what your presence does to me. She looked up at him. And what do I do to you, Graham? The question hit him like an open palm. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because he had too many. You undo me, he said after a long moment. In ways I can't measure. She stood facing him fully now. Her gaze was steady, but her voice trembled when she spoke. I didn't ask to be part of this war. I didn't ask to be your reckoning or your redemption or some moral turning point in a life full of power plays. I was just living. His throat tightened. I know. And now what? You keep me here like some relic you're afraid to. Break again? You think if you lock me away from the world, the damage will disappear? No, he said. I don't think that, not anymore. Her eyes flickered with something softer. Doubt, or maybe a cautious hope. I didn't bring you here to punish you, he added, voice raw. I brought you here because for the first time in my life, I didn't trust myself not to break something. That mattered. I thought if I kept you safe, I could fix what I ruined. And have you? She asked. Fixed it? He didn't answer. She stepped closer, her breath catching. I don't need you to fix me, Graham. I need you to let me feel. To let me grieve what happened. To let me choose how I heal. And if I choose to walk away, I need to know you'll let me. He looked at her. Really looked at her. For the first time, he didn't see the girl who'd appeared in his suite like a ghost meant to haunt him. He didn't see the symbol of his guilt or the key to his redemption. He saw Clara, whole, angry, brave, and so breathtakingly human that it shattered the last illusion he'd been clinging to. I'll let you, he whispered. If that's what you want. She studied him, eyes full of storms he knew he had helped create. I don't know what I want, she said, but I know I don't want to be a prisoner, not here, not anywhere. He nodded slowly. Then you're free. Whenever you want to go. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then quietly she asked, would you have let me go if Julian hadn't shown up? The question landed with precision, and though the truth twisted something dark inside him, he answered honestly. No. There was no defense, no excuse, only honesty. And somehow that mattered more than any apology ever could. She sat again, folding her arms around her knees. This time, when he sat beside her, she didn't move away. The orchard rustled around them. The sky darkened with the coming night. When she finally spoke again, it was not a demand, not an accusation, just a whisper of truth. I'm tired of being fought over. I want to be chosen, and I want to choose in return. He turned to her. Then let me earn that choice. She didn't answer, but she didn't get up either. They sat like that until the stars began to blink into view, until the shadows faded into quiet, and the space between them no longer felt like a battlefield, not quite peace, not quite war, something in between. And in that space, something fragile began to breathe. The morning after the encounter with Julian Cross arrived cloaked in stillness. The sea beyond the cliffs was calm, the sky a muted grey, as if even the world was holding its breath. Clara Munro sat in the sunroom of the estate, barefoot, knees tucked beneath her on a wide armchair. A steaming mug of tea sat untouched on the table beside her. She wasn't reading. She hadn't picked up a book in days, and that frightened her more than she wanted to admit. Stories had always been her refuge, windows into other lives, other hearts. But now, even fiction felt too real, too fragile. Her mind kept circling back to the orchard, to Julian's offer, to Graham's silence, to the fact that, in the end, she'd chosen neither man, but still hadn't chosen herself. She wasn't sure if she regretted staying. But the anger she thought had burned out long ago had rekindled into something quieter, more dangerous. It wasn't rage anymore. It was exhaustion. Graham hadn't spoken to her since she walked away from him. He'd respected her distance. That much at least he had learned. But she could still feel him. In every room. In every unspoken moment. He was watching her again, but not like before. Now he waited for her to look back. Later that afternoon, as shadows stretched across the marble halls of the estate, Clara wandered into the music room. She didn't plan to. Her feet simply took her there, as if memory or instinct were leading her. The grand piano in the corner stood silent and proud, its surface polished to a mirror. She traced a finger along the edge of the keys, not pressing down, just touching. She hadn't played in years. Her mother used to sit beside her on the bench, gently correcting her fingers with a patience Clara had only come to admire after losing her. Without thinking, she sat. Without hesitation, she played. The melody was simple, a childhood song, soft and incomplete, but it filled the room like breath. Notes hung in the air, broken and beautiful. She didn't notice when Graham stepped into the doorway, his silhouette quiet against the golden light. He didn't interrupt. He listened, because for the first time in weeks she wasn't guarded. Her hands spoke what her mouth wouldn't. When she finally stopped, the silence that followed felt sacred. "You used to play," he said softly. She didn't look at him. "I used to be a lot of things." He stepped further in. "You still are." "I don't know who I am anymore." He paused. "I do." That made her turn. Her expression was unreadable. "No, you don't. You know what I was to you. You know the story you created in your head to justify everything you've done. But that's not me." Graham's voice was steady. "Then tell me who you are." She blinked. The audacity of the question stunned her. "I'm someone who used to trust people until it nearly broke me," she said. "Someone who walked into the wrong room and became a symbol of every demon you haven't dealt with. I'm not your cure, Graham. I'm not your lesson. I'm just a woman who wanted a quiet life and found herself trapped in a storm she didn't cause." He took a breath, his throat tight. "I know. And I know I made you part of a story you didn't agree to. But Clara, I swear to you, this isn't about fixing me anymore. It's about undoing what I've already broken." She stood, her heart beating too loudly in her chest. "Then stop trying to rewrite it," she said. "Let the damage be what it is. Stop trying to protect me like a porcelain doll you dropped and want to glue back together." He looked at her, then not with shame but with something far more human. "Pain. I don't know how to let you go," her voice faltered. "Then maybe I should be the one to leave." He stepped forward haltingly. "Would it change anything if I told you I was trying to love you the right way?" She froze. He continued slowly. "Not out of guilt, not out of control, but because I see you now. Every piece. Not as something I own, but as something I never deserved to begin with." The silence swelled. Clara didn't know what to do with that confession. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a plea. It was the truth. And maybe that was what terrified her most. She looked at him, and for the first time she didn't see the man from the penthouse suite, the cold, calculated billionaire who saw deception behind every smile. She saw a man unraveling himself to be worthy. It should have been easier to walk away, but it wasn't. The next few days were different, softer. Graham didn't follow her. He didn't hover. He appeared in shared spaces only when necessary, meals, hallways, the occasional accidental encounter by the garden gate. But when he did speak, it was with restraint, and when he looked at her, it was with quiet reverence. Clara began to see things she hadn't noticed before, like how he sat in the library with a novel open, dog-eared and halfway finished, something she never imagined him doing, or how he spent hours at the desk on the terrace, writing in longhand slowly, thoughtfully, before sealing the pages away in a drawer. He was trying, not to win her, but to become someone he wasn't ashamed to be. And still, she didn't know what to do with that. One evening, she found herself in the kitchen long after the staff had retired. She couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet. The memories too loud. She reached for a pan, intending to make something, anything to distract herself. She never expected to see him there. Graham stood barefoot in sweatpants and a soft grey t-shirt, staring down at a box of pasta like it was quantum physics. "I forgot how to cook," he admitted sheepishly. Clara laughed, genuinely for the first time in weeks. "That's because you never knew how." He looked at her then, eyes warm. "I was hoping you'd help me remember." She rolled her eyes but moved toward the stove. "Fine, but don't burn the garlic." They cooked side by side, fumbling through a recipe neither of them remembered correctly. He spilled olive oil. She dropped a spoon. They laughed more than they expected. When they sat down to eat, on stools with mismatched bowls, they were quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that didn't ache. Later, as they cleaned up, Clara caught him watching her with something unspoken in his eyes. "What?" she asked. He hesitated. "I've spent my whole life conquering things, but I've never wanted to earn something the way I want to earn your trust." She dried her hands on a towel. "Trust isn't earned by cooking pasta," she said, but her voice was softer than before. "I know," he replied, "but it's a start." That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she realized something she wasn't ready to name. She didn't want to leave. Not yet, because maybe somewhere in the ruins of what they had done to each other, there was something worth rebuilding. Not a fairy tale, not redemption, just possibility. Later that week, a storm moved in from the sea. It came fast and without warning. The wind whipped through the estate like it had a message to deliver. The sky turned a deep bruised grey and rain battered the wide glass windows. Clara stood by one of them in the hallway, arms folded, watching the world blur beyond the glass. She'd always loved storms, the chaos of them, the way they demanded your attention, your surrender. There was something honest about a sky that couldn't hide how it felt. Graham found her there. She didn't move when he approached. She felt him before she saw him, the way you can feel thunder before it breaks. "The storm's bad," he said gently, his voice quiet so as not to disturb. "The moment," she nodded. "It reminds me of when I was a kid. My mum and I used to sit on the porch and count the seconds between lightning and thunder. She'd say the sky was just arguing with itself." Graham smiled faintly. "I think I've lived my entire life, like a thunderstorm trying to hold itself in." She turned to look at him, surprised by the metaphor. "Then maybe," she said softly, "you should let it out once in a while. Just not on other people." His expression faltered, and then something in him crumbled just a little more. "I'm not used to being seen like this," he admitted. Clara tilted her head. "Like what?" "Like I'm not invincible. Like I'm not always in control." Her gaze didn't waver. "You never were, Graham. You just pretended better than most." That hit harder than he expected. She walked past him then, not cruelly but firmly, like she had said all she needed to. But before she reached the stairs, his voice stopped her. "Clara." She paused. He stepped closer, his hands clenching at his sides, but he didn't reach for her. "I know you don't owe me anything, and I know you may never forgive me, but I need you to understand something." She turned slightly, waiting. He took a breath. "You're not the reason I changed. You're the reason I wanted to." That wasn't a line. It wasn't romantic or rehearsed. It was the kind of truth that cost him to say, and for a brief moment, Clara's heart ached. Not out of pity, but because part of her wanted to believe him. Part of her did believe him, but belief wasn't the same as trust, and trust would take more than words whispered during a storm. That night, unable to sleep, Clara wandered the halls again. The storm had quieted into a gentle drizzle, and the house felt warmer somehow, safer. She passed by the study door and paused. Light flickered beneath it. She hesitated, then knocked once. "Come in." She pushed the door open and found Graham at his desk, surrounded by papers and books, wearing reading glasses she had never seen before. He looked up, startled but not displeased. "Couldn't sleep," she said simply. "Me neither." She stepped inside, her fingers brushing the back of a leather armchair. "What are you working on?" "A letter," he said, then added with a half smile. "Do you?" Clara raised an eyebrow. "You could just talk to me." "I could, but I think I write better when I'm trying not to mess it up." She considered that, then sat in the chair across from him. "Read it to me," she said. He blinked. "Now?" She nodded. So he did. His voice was low, a little rough, like he wasn't used to reading aloud anymore. The letter wasn't perfect, it rambled in places. It got lost in its own emotion once or twice. But it was real. It spoke of regret, of memory, of all the things he should have said the night she walked into his suite, of how he saw her now, of how he wanted to move forward not by dragging her with him, but by walking beside her if she ever let him. When he finished, the silence stretched between them. Clara's eyes were glassy, but she didn't cry. She simply nodded. "Thank you," she said, "for saying what I needed to hear, even if I don't know what I'm going to do with it yet." "I don't need an answer," he replied. "Just the chance to keep showing up." And for the first time since arriving at the estate, Clara didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt seen. And that, she realized, was the beginning of something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Hope. The rhythm of their days at the Vineyard estate began to shift in quiet, imperceptible ways. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden declarations. No sweeping gestures. It was in the details. Clara woke each morning to the soft scent of coffee lingering down the hallway. He'd started making it himself, always leaving a fresh cup in the kitchen, even when she didn't come down right away. She never asked him to, and he never asked if she drank it. But she noticed the warmth it held, the unspoken invitation that said, "If today's the day you want to talk, I'm here." Sometimes they passed each other in the hall and exchanged only a look, a nod, a brief acknowledgement that neither of them was quite who they had been the day before. Other times she found herself lingering, asking questions, accepting small kindnesses. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was something close to breathing in the same space without needing to flinch. They started reading together, by accident. At first, she had been curled up on the sunroom sofa with a novel one evening when Graham walked in, a book tucked under his arm. He paused, about to turn back, but she had looked up and said quietly, "Stay," and he had. She didn't know when their silences stopped feeling strained. Maybe it was the second or third night when they sat opposite each other reading in. Shared quiet, their legs brushing beneath the low coffee table, neither of them daring to move. Or maybe it was when she caught him glancing at her when he thought she wasn't looking, not with hunger or regret, but with awe, as if he still couldn't believe she was real. One morning, Clara found herself in the greenhouse tucked behind, the east wing of the estate. The staff barely used it, and most of the plants had gone wild from neglect. Vines stretched across the ceiling beams, and sunlight poured in through dusty glass panels like liquid gold. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She didn't ask permission. She didn't tell anyone. It just felt like something she could control, a mess she could tame. When Graham passed by a few hours later, still in a dress shirt and slacks from a morning conference call, he stopped short at the sight of her on her knees in the soil, dirt streaked across her cheek. "What are you doing?" She didn't look up. "Resurrecting the dead." "Should I be concerned?" She smiled. "Only if you step on my time." He didn't know whether to laugh or kneel beside her, so he did both. Over the next few days, the greenhouse became a strange kind of sanctuary for them. He brought her tea in thermoses. She taught him how to prune orchids without murdering them. He confessed he once bought a bonsai tree and accidentally drowned it, she said, glancing at his muddy hands. "You're much more human when you're not in a suit." He looked at her, really looked at her. I think I spent so long becoming something untouchable. I forgot what it meant to feel like a man. Clara's breath hitched, not from fear, but from recognition, because she wasn't the same woman who had walked into his suite weeks ago. She had changed too. She didn't flinch from his gaze anymore, didn't brace herself for cruelty. And somewhere in the rhythm of digging, watering, rebuilding, she began to let herself imagine what it might look like to stay. Not out of obligation or safety, but out of something dangerously close to choice. Then came the night the power went out. A spring storm had swept in off the ocean, howling louder than anything before. A lightning strike hit the transformer near the edge of the property, plunging the estate into darkness. Clara had been in her room, curled beneath a blanket, when the world flickered and went still. For a moment she lay frozen, heart pounding, faster than she cared to admit. But then a soft knock came at her door. It opened gently, a flashlight haloed around Graham's face. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, sitting up, just startled. "I've lit some candles in the main hall," he said. "Thought you might want company." Something in his tone made her stand. They walked the length of the corridor together. The estate, stripped of all its ambient hums and lights, felt older, more intimate. In the grand room, dozens of candles flickered across surfaces, mantels, sideboards, candelabras brought from storage. The glow was soft and warm, wrapping everything in golden haze. They sat near the fire, its heat breathing against their skin. Outside, wind lashed at the windows, but inside there was only stillness. He poured them both wine, not the expensive vintage he usually favored, just something simple and red, something grounding. Clara sipped in silence, then turned toward him. "Were you always this lonely?" He didn't flinch. Not at first. But eventually, he met her eyes. "Eventually I stopped noticing, until you walked in that night and reminded me what it felt like to want connection again." She exhaled slowly. "I don't know what you want from me anymore." "Neither do I," he said, voice low. "I just know I don't want to lose, whatever this is, even if it's fragile, even if it's temporary." The fire cracked beside them. She leaned back, watching the flames dance. "It's not temporary," she said after a while. "It's just new, and new things don't have names right away." They didn't touch that night, didn't kiss. But when the candles burned low and the wine bottle was empty, he walked her back to her room. And when she hesitated in the doorway, he didn't push. "Good night, Clara," he said. Her name sounded like prayer and apology at once. And when she closed the door behind her, she leaned against it and smiled. Not because she was falling in love, but because she was no longer afraid. 2. The next morning, she woke to birdsong and the scent of fresh bread. She came downstairs to find the kitchen filled with sunlight and Graham at the stove, apron tied crookedly around his waist. "I'm attempting pancakes," he said, flipping one with theatrical clumsiness. She laughed. "You're lucky I don't. Judge on presentation. You'd be surprised how far burnt batter can go when paired with orange marmalade." They ate together at the kitchen counter, and she found herself studying him, how his stubble softened his face in the morning light, how he no longer tried to fill silence with apologies. "How do you know this is real?" she asked suddenly, her fork suspended in midair. He looked at her. "What do you mean? This, you, us, this life. How do you know it's not just guilt in disguise?" He set his fork down, thoughtful. "Because when you're not in the room," he said slowly, "the world feels muted. When you laugh, it feels like someone turned the volume up on my life. And when you're angry with me, I'd rather face a room full of shareholders than disappoint you." She blinked. "And because," he added, "for the first time, I'm not afraid to let someone see who I really am. Not the polished image. Just me." Clara's chest tightened. "That's terrifying." "I know. And brave." He met her gaze, steady and calm. "So are you." In that moment, the space between them wasn't filled with history or regret. It was filled with something soft, something sacred. A beginning. And neither of them dared to move, afraid to disturb the fragile shape of hope unfolding between them. That afternoon, Clara found herself walking the beach alone. The storm had cleared. Hours earlier, leaving behind a shoreline littered with seaweed and driftwood, but also a stillness that called to her. She took off her shoes, letting the wet sand cool her feet, her skirt whipping around her calves. The horizon stretched endlessly. She hadn't seen this part of the island before, beyond the cliffs, beyond the carefully curated estate grounds. It was raw and imperfect and beautiful in a way the polished mansion could never be. She heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn right away, but she already knew. Graham's voice was quiet. "Didn't know you wandered this far." "I didn't mean to," she said, still walking. "I just kept going." He matched her pace. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. "There's something about places like this," she said, "where nothing's been touched, where the world isn't trying so hard to be beautiful. It reminds me that not everything has to be perfect to be worth keeping." He looked at her then, and it struck him that she wasn't just speaking about the shoreline. He stopped walking. "Clara," she turned to him. "I know I've said a lot of things," he began, "but I need to say one more. And I need you to believe it's not coming from guilt or from some idea of making things right." She didn't speak, just listened. He stepped closer. "You're not the exception to my past. You're the answer to it. All those years I spent building walls, I thought I was protecting myself. But I was just hiding. And then you, this fierce, gentle, maddeningly brave woman, you showed up in the one moment I wasn't ready, and you cracked everything open." Her heart beat faster. She hadn't expected this. Not here. Not now. "I was a man who believed I couldn't love," he continued. "But you've made me want to learn. I want to learn what it means to hold someone without fear, to protect someone without caging them, to love without ownership." Clara blinked hard, her throat tightening. "I don't know what you see when you look at me now," he said, "but I hope it's not just the man who hurt you. I hope in some small way you see the man who's becoming someone better because of you." Clara stepped forward. She wasn't ready to say it. Not love, not forgiveness. But she reached for his hand, and when their fingers intertwined, it wasn't possessive. It wasn't desperate. It was steady. "I see a man who's still learning," she whispered, "and for the first time, I'm not afraid to learn with him." The waves crashed gently in the background. They stood like that until the sky turned gold with the approach of evening. On the walk back, they didn't talk much. Words weren't needed. The silence between them now felt different, like a garden, finally blooming after winter. That night, Clara sat in her room, brushing her hair at the vanity. There was no knock at the door, no invitation. But something in her heart had already begun to whisper. She opened the door herself. Graham was sitting on the steps of the hallway as if waiting to be turned away. She didn't speak. She simply extended her hand. And this time, when he followed her in, it wasn't out of guilt. It wasn't about apologies. It was about a connection neither of them could deny anymore. In the quiet candlelit warmth of the room, he didn't touch her right away. He didn't assume. He waited. Clara stepped toward him, her fingers ghosting over his jaw. He closed his eyes at the contact. "You still think you're not worthy?" she murmured. "I don't think," he said, voice rough. "I know, but I also know I'll spend every day trying to be." She kissed him, not out of weakness, not out of longing, but out of choice. It was slow, honest, new. That night they didn't fall into bed with fire. They built a moment with hands and breath and silence. And for the first time there was no pain beneath the closeness, no fear, just two people who had been broken, learning how to hold something sacred without shattering it. And when they finally slept, twined together, heartbeats steady, it wasn't about who they had been. It was about who they could become. Weeks passed like water through cupped hands, slow at first, then all at once. Spring melted into early summer. The estate bloomed with the kind of color Clara had never noticed before. Roses flushed in full blush along the garden path. Lavender perfumed the greenhouse. The vineyard whispered with the promise of a harvest. But what surprised her most was how much of it she'd come to call her own. Not because Graham gave it to her, but because she had stayed long enough to shape it. She still woke with questions. There were mornings when doubt brushed against her, like fog when memories of that night in the penthouse crept in uninvited. But then there were mornings when she found herself smiling before opening her eyes, simply because she knew she'd hear his voice, or the quiet clink of dishes from the kitchen, or feel his hand, steady and warm, resting beside hers. They weren't perfect, but perfection had never been the goal. They were something else now, real, unfinished, and quietly choosing one another, over and over. Graham had changed, not loudly, not for show. He had become softer in his truths, steadier in his care. He learned when to speak and when to listen. He made space for her grief and didn't try to fix it. Sometimes he simply sat beside her when she stared out at the sea, saying nothing, just letting the silence hold them both. And in those moments, Clara realized she wasn't healing because of him. She was healing with him. One golden afternoon, she walked into the drawing room to find him bent over a small velvet box, fumbling with something inside. He looked up as she entered, startled. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said, tucking it behind his back. She raised a brow, amused. "You're terrible at hiding things." "Only from you," he replied, half smiling. "You undo me too easily." She stepped closer. "Was it what I think it was?" He hesitated. "A ring, yes." Clara's breath caught. "But not because I need you to say yes right now," he added quickly. "Not even because I need a ceremony. I bought it because I realized something last night, while you were sleeping beside me." She tilted her head, waiting. "I want every morning to begin with your face," he said. "I want every argument to be a fight we both return from. I want every ordinary day to feel extraordinary because you're in it." He took a breath, then pulled the box from behind him and opened it. The diamond was simple, oval cut, set on a band of white gold etched with tiny vines. Not showy, not loud, just like her. "I know what I did," he said softly, "and I know there are parts of me that will always carry darkness. But if you let me, I want to be the man who walks beside you, who grows with you, who never forgets." How easily he could have lost the only light that ever saw him for who he truly was. Clara didn't reach for the box, she reached for his hand, and in that simple gesture she gave him her answer. "I don't need perfection, Graham," she whispered. "I just need you to keep showing up." His eyes burned as he slid the ring onto her finger, not as a claim, but as a vow. They didn't throw a lavish wedding. No grand event. No headlines. Just a quiet ceremony beneath the olive trees behind the greenhouse. The same place where they'd first planted something together, not knowing it would grow into more than they ever expected. Clara wore a dress the color of late summer cream, her hair loose around her shoulders. Graham stood beside her in rolled sleeves, no tie, his heart in his eyes. A few close friends, some staff, and the wind as witness. When they exchanged vows, there were no grand speeches, just simple truths. "I was a man who never believed in second chances," Graham said, "until you forgave what I hadn't forgiven in myself." "I was a woman who forgot how to trust," Clara replied, "until you showed me that growth can live even in the ruins." And when they kissed, it wasn't with passion forged from fire, but with the peace of two people who had finally come home. In the months that followed, their lives unfolded like pages gently turned. Clara began writing again. Graham supported her quietly, never asking to read her words, only ensuring she had the freedom to create them. She dedicated her first published piece to "the man who taught me that even broken things can bloom again." They traveled, but never too far. Greece, the Amalfi Coast, sometimes just a picnic in the nearby vineyards, always together, always slow. They built their lives not on what had once broken them, but on what they had learned to rebuild. And one autumn evening, as Clara stood beneath the orange glow of the trees, a hand resting gently over her swelling belly, Graham wrapped his arms around her from behind. "You're still the most unexpected thing that's ever happened to me," he murmured. She smiled. "And you're the only risk I'd take again." Their story hadn't begun gently, but it had become something beautiful. And in the quiet, unwavering love they had chosen, day after day, mistake after mistake, they had rewritten what it meant to be saved, not by force, not by fate, but by choice. Together, forever, in the end. Clara and Graham's story isn't just about love, it's about transformation. It's about two broken souls who collided under the most painful of circumstances and somehow, through raw honesty and quiet perseverance, discovered healing in each other's arms. From darkness to light, from mistrust to devotion, their journey teaches us that love doesn't always begin with beauty. Sometimes it begins with ruin. But when people are willing to grow, to forgive, and to truly see one another, not as projects or redemption arcs, but as whole complex human beings, then love becomes something deeper, something enduring. We learn that power without compassion is empty. That guilt cannot replace accountability, And that healing isn't linear. It's slow, messy, and often uncomfortable. But it's worth it. Because at the heart of this story lies a truth we all need to hear. No matter how scarred your past is, no matter how impossible it feels to trust again, you are still worthy of love. A love that asks for nothing but your truth and gives everything. In return, Clara found her voice. Graham found his humanity. And together, they rewrote a future neither of them dared dream. If this story touched you, moved you, or reminded you of the power of redemption and love, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the motivation to bring you even more meaningful, emotional content in the future. Let's continue to explore stories that matter. Stories that heal, inspire, and remind us that second chances are never out of reach. Subscribe now and don't miss what's coming next.